Story number 1. I was about 10 when it happened, and to this day, I still don't know what kind of luck or fate saved me that afternoon. My family lived on the outskirts of a small town, near a huge forest that stretched for miles. It wasn't unusual for kids in the neighborhood to venture in there, even though our parents always warned us about getting lost. Of course, as a kid, you think you're invincible, and nothing bad ever really happens, right? It was a warm summer day, and my friends and I had set out on what we thought would be a quick adventure. Just a typical, explore the woods kind of thing. We'd done it a million times. Only this time, we decided to go deeper than we ever had before. The further we walked, the thicker the trees got, and the more the sunlight seemed to disappear. I remember feeling that first twinge of unease, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After about an hour, we came across this massive old tree with carvings all over the bark. Names, dates, weird symbols. It was creepy but kind of cool, so we hung out around it for a bit, daring each other to add our own marks. That's when things started to go wrong. One of my friends, Tyler, wandered off to the other side of the tree. We could still hear him joking around, but his voice was getting fainter. I figured he'd come back soon, but minutes went by, and there was no sign of him. "Ty, quit messing around," I shouted, trying to sound tough, even though I felt my heart racing. Nothing. Silence. The other guys started to get nervous too, but no one wanted to admit it. So, we split up, each of us going in a different direction to find him. I took the path straight ahead, hoping I'd hear him laugh or see him peeking from behind a tree any second now. I walked for what felt like hours, the woods getting eerily quiet around me. No birds, no rustling leaves, just that creepy kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. There was this small, run-down cabin in the middle of the woods, something I'd never seen before, not in all the years I'd explored these woods. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, the windows broken, the roof sagging. Against my better judgment, I crept closer, hoping maybe Tyler had found it first and was hiding inside, waiting to jump out and scare us. As I approached, I heard the faintest sound, like crying. My heart sank. It wasn't Tyler's voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. I froze, listening harder, trying to make sense of it. I should have run right then and there. I should have turned around and never looked back, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity, maybe. Stupidity, definitely. I stepped onto the creaky wooden porch and peered through the cracked door. Inside, it was dark and cold, much colder than it should have been for a summer day. The crying stopped. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the porch. Standing just a few feet away was a man, dirty, disheveled, his clothes torn like he'd been living out there for years. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear to God, I've never seen a human look so hollow. He didn't say a word, just kept staring at me like he was deciding something. My legs were jelly, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then he took a step forward. I don't know what finally snapped me out of it, but I turned and bolted. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the trees, branches whipping my face. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I was out of the woods and back in my neighborhood, gasping for breath. When I finally told my parents what happened, they didn't believe me. They thought I'd made the whole thing up to explain why Tyler and I had gotten separated. But I knew what I saw. The next day, the police came to our door. Tyler hadn't come home. Search parties were sent into the woods, and they scoured every inch, but they never found him. Not a trace, not even a footprint. To this day, I can't walk by those woods without feeling that same dread creeping up my spine. And every time I close my eyes, I see that man's face, those cold, empty eyes watching me, deciding whether I was next. Story number 2. I never thought I'd see the day where I'd be forced to fight for my life, but the universe has a twisted way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. I was a pretty regular guy, married with a couple of kids, working a decent 9-to-5 job that wasn't going to win me any awards, but kept food on the table. The only thing extraordinary about me was how painfully ordinary I felt, until one evening turned me into a man I barely recognized. It was a Thursday night. My wife Jenna had gone out with some friends, and I was home with the kids, Emily and Zach, ages 7 and 4. I had just put them to bed when the sound of glass shattering echoed from downstairs. It was one of those sounds that doesn't register as dangerous at first. You hear it, and for a split second your brain goes, oh, maybe I knocked over a glass. Except, I was upstairs. There was no way I'd broken anything. My stomach sank as the realization hit me. Someone had broken into the house. I froze. my heart pounding so loud it felt like the whole neighborhood could hear it. I wasn't some action hero. I didn't have any training for this. Hell, the most I'd ever fought was a mosquito. But now, there was someone in my house, and I had 2 kids to protect. I quietly locked their bedroom door and whispered to Emily, "Stay quiet, sweetheart. Don't come out, no matter what." I tiptoed out into the hallway, grabbing the only thing I could find, a metal bat I'd stupidly bought thinking I'd take up softball again someday. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way down the stairs, the bat trembling in my grip. There were muffled sounds coming from the kitchen, and I could see the outline of a figure moving in the dark. I tried to think of something, anything to say. Something tough, something that would make him realize I wasn't someone to mess with. But all that came out was a shaky, "Get out of my house." The figure froze, turning toward me slowly. My blood turned cold as I saw him fully for the first time, a tall, broad man wearing a ski mask and holding what looked like a crowbar. He didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. He just stared at me, like he was sizing me up, deciding if I was a threat or just an obstacle. The adrenaline hit me like a freight train. My mind was racing, thinking about Jenna, about Emily and Zach upstairs, about how this man could destroy everything I loved in a heartbeat. I gripped the bat tighter, feeling the sweat in my palms, and took a step forward. My voice was steadier this time. I said, "Get out." That's when he lunged at me. I swung the bat blindly, feeling the impact as it connected with something. His arm, maybe his shoulder, I don't know. He grunted but didn't stop. He slammed into me, and suddenly, we were on the floor. I couldn't breathe, his weight crushing me as I struggled beneath him. He raised the crowbar, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a robbery. He wasn't here for money. He was here to hurt me, maybe worse. Everything slowed down. I saw his arm coming down, the glint of the crowbar in the dim light. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to twist just enough to avoid the blow. The crowbar smashed into the floor next to my head, and I could feel the cold metal scrape my skin as I wrestled to push him off me. Somehow, by pure instinct or adrenaline, I got the upper hand. I kicked him hard in the stomach, and he staggered back just enough for me to scramble to my feet. I swung the bat again, harder this time, catching him square in the chest. He doubled over, gasping for air, and I didn't wait for him to recover. I just kept swinging, over and over, until he was on the ground, motionless. I stood there panting, the bat still raised in the air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My mind was racing with 100 thoughts. Is he dead? What the hell just happened? What if he gets back up? But my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the man I had just beaten to a pulp in my own kitchen. It wasn't until I heard a small voice from the top of the stairs that I snapped out of it. "Daddy?" I turned and saw Emily, her wide eyes peeking around the corner, clutching her stuffed bear. I dropped the bat immediately, rushing to her and scooping her up in my arms. "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay. Daddy's here. You're safe." The next few hours were a blur. The police came, my wife rushed home, and I found myself telling the story over and over again, to the officers, to Jenna, to the paramedics who checked me out. They arrested the guy, said he was some repeat offender they'd been after for months. Lucky me, right? I was the house he'd picked that night. In the days that followed, I tried to go back to normal. I told myself I was fine, that everything was okay, that I had done what any father would have done. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lunging at me again, the crowbar coming down. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing phantom sounds of glass breaking downstairs. I don't know if I'll ever shake the fear that's lodged itself in my chest. The rational part of me knows it's over, that he's behind bars. But the other part, the part that wakes up in the dead of night, listening for footsteps that aren't there, well, that part's not so sure. I keep the bat under my bed now, just in case. Story number 3. It's funny how quickly life can flip on you. One moment, everything is fine, completely normal, and the next, well, you're fighting for your life, literally. I never thought I'd experience that feeling until last year. What started as an innocent camping trip with my 2 best friends turned into one of the most terrifying nights of my life, one that I still have nightmares about. We'd been planning the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a guy's weekend, just us, the mountains, and no cell service. We'd go hiking during the day, sit around the fire at night, talk about nothing and everything. It's what we did every year, and every year it was the same peaceful, laid-back routine. This time though, something felt off from the start. I'm not the superstitious type, but I swear there was a strange vibe the moment we reached the campsite. It was way more remote than we'd expected. The trees were thick, casting shadows even in the middle of the afternoon. The whole area had this stillness. No wind, no sounds of birds, no insects buzzing. Just dead silence. I remember joking about it, saying we were probably trespassing on haunted land, but no one laughed. That first night, we sat around the campfire, passing around beers and talking about random things. We heard rustling in the trees a few times, but we shrugged it off. Probably just deer or squirrels. At least that's what I told myself. It wasn't until the fire started dying down that things got weird. Around midnight, my buddy Jack pointed out that there was light coming from the other side of the trees. It wasn't a flashlight or anything like that. It was this faint bluish glow, kind of like a distant campfire, but colder. We figured maybe some other hikers had set up camp nearby, but we hadn't seen anyone else all day. Curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and followed the glow into the woods. The further we walked, the dimmer our flashlights seemed to get, which didn't make sense. I mean, they were brand new. That's when I noticed the temperature had dropped, like, significantly. I was shivering, even though it was July. Something in my gut was telling me to turn back, but we kept going. The glow was getting brighter now, and it seemed to be moving. After about 20 minutes of walking, we reached a clearing. In the middle of it, there was this thing. At first I thought it was a campfire, but the flames weren't orange or red. They were blue, and they didn't flicker or crackle like fire should. They just floated there, twisting and swirling like smoke. Around the fire were these stones arranged in a circle, but they weren't like any stones I'd ever seen. They were smooth, almost polished, and they had strange markings carved into them, symbols I didn't recognize. We stood there in stunned silence, staring at it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, like we'd walked into something we weren't supposed to see. Jack took a step forward, and that's when we heard it. A voice, not loud, not a shout, just a whisper, barely audible, but it echoed all around us. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was cold, like ice slipping down your spine. Jack froze. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, staring into the flames, his face completely blank. "Jack, we need to go," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. He didn't respond, he just kept staring. Then the whispering got louder, and it was coming from all around us, like the trees themselves were speaking. I grabbed his arm, yanked him back, and finally snapped him out of whatever trance he was in. He blinked a few times, like he was waking up from a dream, and without a word, we all turned and bolted back to the campsite. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. We packed up as quickly as we could, and by sunrise, we were driving back to the city. None of us have mentioned it since. It's like this unspoken agreement. We all know what happened, but we refuse to acknowledge it. A few weeks later, out of sheer curiosity, I tried looking up anything I could find about that area. Local legends, ghost stories, anything. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There was a story, buried in an old newspaper archive, about a group of settlers that had disappeared in those woods over a century ago. According to the article, their camp was found abandoned, with strange symbols carved into the trees around them. The article mentioned that some of the locals believed the settlers had stumbled upon something ancient, something that didn't want to be disturbed. There were whispers about cursed land, about spirits that lured people in with lights and voices, only to take them. That was the last time I ever went camping. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw and what I heard. Something was out there, and it didn't want us to leave, but we did, and I'm grateful every day that we did. Story number 4. It's funny how quiet everything gets when your life is on the line. You'd think there'd be panic, screaming, maybe even your own thoughts racing in your head, but no. For me, it was dead silent. Not even the sound of my own heartbeat. Just the cold realization that I might not make it out of this. It was about 2 years ago, and I was on my way back from a late shift. The kind where you stay in the office until your eyes burn from staring at the screen for too long. I was tired, my head fuzzy, but I kept going because the highway was mostly empty, and home was only about 15 minutes away. I figured I'd grab some fast food on the way, shower, and pass out. Routine stuff, right? Except that night, the universe had other plans. It was raining. Not a heavy downpour, but that annoying drizzle that makes the roads just slick enough to be dangerous. I wasn't speeding or anything, just keeping up with the few cars around me. I remember glancing in my rearview mirror, checking out the car behind me. It was one of those tricked-out muscle cars, headlights so bright they practically blinded you. I could see the driver getting antsy, weaving in and out of the lane like he was late for the apocalypse. I let him pass, shaking my head at his reckless driving, and went back to focusing on the road ahead. It wasn't long before I saw him again though, This time, a few cars up, causing chaos. He was swerving, tailgating, cutting people off. It was like watching a crash happen in slow motion, except you don't know when or how, just that it's coming. And then, it did. I was just about to take the exit from my street when the car in front of me slammed on its brakes, hard. I barely had time to react, hitting my own brakes as my tires skidded across the wet pavement. I felt the back end of my car fishtail, and that's when I saw it. The muscle car, out of control, spinning directly into my lane. I've never felt time stretch like that. The world slowed down to the point where I could see every raindrop, every shimmer of the headlights reflecting off the wet road. I had two choices: plow into the car in front of me or swerve into the other lane and pray there wasn't anyone else coming. I swerved. For a split second, I thought I was going to make it. My car glided into the next lane like it was on ice skates, dodging the spinning car by inches. But then, out of nowhere, I felt it. The impact, hard, from the passenger side, like a freight train hitting a brick wall. The force of it lifted my car off the ground, and I spun out of control, heading straight for the guardrail. The only thing that went through my mind in those final moments before the crash was, this is it. I thought about my wife. I thought about my parents. I thought about how I never told my brother I was proud of him, even though I should have. It was weird, like my life didn't flash before my eyes, but these random things, unfinished conversations, moments I'd taken for granted, all the things I hadn't done yet. The sound of metal crunching was deafening as my car slammed into the guardrail. The impact threw me forward so hard that the seatbelt cut into my chest, knocking the air out of me. For a moment, I didn't know if I was alive or dead. Everything was spinning, upside down, inside out, like my brain couldn't catch up with what had just happened. When the car finally stopped, I was tilted sideways. The passenger side crumpled like an accordion against the rail. The engine was hissing, smoke pouring out from somewhere, and I smelled something burning. Rubber, maybe. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't even move. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of the fact that I was still breathing. That's when I heard the other driver, the guy in the muscle car. He was shouting, screaming at someone, probably on his phone, yelling that it wasn't his fault, that someone had cut him off, that he was fine while the rest of us. Well, we were lucky to be alive. The cops and paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. They had to pry the door open to get me out. I remember one of the paramedics asking me if I could move my legs, if I could feel my hands, and it was like I hadn't even noticed my own body until that moment. Everything hurt, but I was alive, somehow. Turns out the guy in the muscle car had been drinking. He'd blown through a stoplight earlier, almost hit someone there too. And me? I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was lucky, they said. A couple of cracked ribs, a concussion, and some stitches on my arm where the window shattered, but no lasting damage. At least, not physically. But the mental scars, those don't go away as easily. Every time I get behind the wheel now, I feel that moment creeping back up on me. The spinning car, the impact, the realization that I might not make it home. It's like a shadow that follows me, lurking in the background, reminding me how fragile everything really is. I didn't sleep for weeks after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that I could hear the screech of tires, the crash all over again. And every time I pass that stretch of road, my stomach drops, like I'm right back there, about to swerve, about to crash. I still drive, I still live my life. But something shifted that night. That silence, the moment where time stretched and everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. That's something you don't forget. It stays with you, even when you think you've moved on. I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, but sometimes, being lucky doesn't feel that lucky at all. Story number 1. I'm still surprised we didn't get expelled for what we pulled off during senior year. It was supposed to be just a simple prank, something to make our class stand out, leave a legacy, you know? What we didn't expect was for things to escalate the way they did, and honestly, we didn't mean for anyone to end up at the hospital. I swear. It all started with Dan. He was the kind of guy who was always full of half-baked ideas, but convinced they were genius. You know the type. Always scheming, always looking for some way to stir things up without actually thinking about the consequences. Well, this time, his brilliant idea was to borrow a couple of the chickens from the agriculture department's barn and release them in the school. Think about it, he said. Chickens running around the hallways during finals week? It'll be epic. The teachers will lose their minds. In hindsight, this should have been the first red flag, but at the time, we were all in. It sounded harmless enough, right? Just a few chickens, some harmless chaos. What could go wrong? We snuck into the barn the night before with a duffel bag. Yes, a duffel bag. As if we were going to stuff live chickens into it like they were footballs. This was when we realized that none of us actually knew how to handle chickens. Dan, the genius mastermind, couldn't even pick one up. Every time he got close, it would squawk and flap its wings like it was possessed. Eventually, we managed to corral 2 of them into a large dog crate we found in the janitor's closet. The next morning, we strolled into school like it was any other day, except we had a crate full of chickens in the back of Dan's beat-up Honda. We waited until first period was almost over before making our move. Dan and I ducked out of class, carrying the crate between us like we were delivering a pizza. As soon as we reached the main hallway, we pulled open the crate door and let them loose. That's when everything went wrong. First, I didn't know chickens could run that fast. These things bolted down the hallway like someone had set their tail feathers on fire. Kids started screaming, diving out of the way, and at least 3 people slipped trying to chase them. One chicken darted into the girls' bathroom while the other took off toward the cafeteria. Chaos. Absolute chaos. We thought that was the worst of it, but then things took a dark turn. Apparently, these weren't just your average chickens. They were part of some science experiment, and one of them was on some kind of medication. Of course, we had no clue. All we knew was that suddenly, kids were shouting, and teachers were sprinting down the halls trying to catch these feathered tornadoes. The one that ran into the girls' bathroom? Well, it slipped on the wet floor, slid into a stall, and hit its head on the toilet. You can't make this stuff up. They had to call the school nurse, and next thing we knew, an ambulance was pulling up outside to take a chicken, to the vet. I can still hear Dan whispering, "Do you think we'll be charged with animal cruelty?" Like this was some kind of criminal mastermind operation gone wrong. And if that wasn't bad enough, the second chicken, remember, the one that ran toward the cafeteria, somehow ended up in the kitchen, where it knocked over a giant pot of soup, spilling boiling liquid all over the place. One of the lunch ladies slipped in the mess, and before we knew it, she was being wheeled out on a stretcher with a broken arm. That's when we realized we might have taken this a little too far. By the time the principal caught wind of what was happening, the entire school was in a state of total pandemonium. Classes were canceled, and they locked down the building like it was an active shooter situation, except instead of hunting for a dangerous criminal, they were hunting for a chicken. The aftermath was intense. They called an emergency assembly, where the principal stood on stage, red-faced and fuming, while the rest of us sat there, trying to act innocent. No one could prove it was us, yet, but everyone had their suspicions, especially when Dan started asking if chickens could survive concussions during third period. The school brought in extra security for the rest of finals week, just in case anyone else got any bright ideas. And the chickens? Well, one recovered fully, but the other had to be retired from the experiment. No one ever explained what that meant, but it didn't sound good. The lunch lady with the broken arm, she got a settlement, and rumor has it, she now tells everyone she was taken out by a chicken riot. As for us, we managed to get away with it, barely. There was a lot of whispering, a few side glances from teachers, but no one ever confronted us directly. Maybe they were too embarrassed to admit they'd been bested by a couple of high school kids and some rogue poultry. Either way, we never pulled a prank like that again. But every time I walk by a rotisserie chicken at the grocery store, I can't help but laugh a little and think, we could have been legends. Story number 2. It's been almost a decade, and I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday lunch period, nothing special, just another boring high school day. But then the fight broke out, and all hell broke loose. I'm talking about the kind of chaos you only see in movies, where everyone just stops what they're doing to watch the madness unfold. The craziest part? It wasn't just any fight. It was the football team versus the basketball team. Yeah, the entire teams. Let me back up a bit. See, our school was known for 2 things: our undefeated football team and our star-studded basketball team. We were one of those high schools that lived and breathed sports, so the athletes were basically celebrities. But for some reason, there was always this unspoken rivalry between the football and basketball players. Maybe it was ego. Maybe it was about who got more attention from the cheerleaders. Or maybe it was just because both teams wanted to be top dog. Whatever it was, things were tense, especially during lunch when everyone hung out in the same cafeteria. I should have known something was about to go down when I walked in and saw the football guys giving the basketball dudes some serious side-eye. At first, I thought it was just typical trash talk. You know, nothing serious. But then, out of nowhere, Troy, one of the football linebackers, stood up and chucked an entire tray of food across the room. It sailed through the air in slow motion, landing right on the captain of the basketball team, Derek. And Derek? He didn't even flinch, just wiped mashed potatoes off his jersey like it was no big deal. But his teammates? Yeah, they weren't having it. Within seconds, Derek's whole crew was up, and suddenly, the football guys started rising from their tables like an army ready to go to war. I'm telling you, the tension in the room skyrocketed, and it felt like time was slowing down as the two teams stared each other down, waiting for someone to throw the first punch. And then it happened. I didn't see who swung first, but once that punch landed, it was on. The cafeteria exploded into chaos, fists flying, trays crashing to the floor, food splattering everywhere. People were screaming, some climbing onto the tables just to get a better view of the carnage. It was like an old school brawl, only with more milk cartons and pizza slices getting launched into the air. I swear, the entire cafeteria turned into one massive fight club, and all of us regular students were just caught in the crossfire. I tried ducking out of the way, but there were so many people crowding the exits that I couldn't even move. Meanwhile, Derek and Troy were in the middle of it, going toe-to-toe like it was a heavyweight boxing match, while their teammates tackled each other left and right. I figured it was only a matter of time before the teachers showed up to shut it down, but, nope. The teachers were either too shocked or too smart to step into that war zone. I remember seeing Mr. Peterson, our gym teacher, just standing by the door, shaking his head like, I'm not paid enough for this. Just when it seemed like the cafeteria was going to be torn apart, something completely unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, the lacrosse team burst into the room. They were supposed to be having practice, but apparently, someone had told them about the fight, and they decided they wanted in on the action. Or at least, that's what I thought at first. But instead of jumping into the brawl, they broke it up. I don't know how, but these guys just ran straight into the middle of the chaos, separating the football and basketball players like they were breaking up a street fight. It was nuts. One of the lacrosse guys literally picked up a football player and moved him out of the way like he was a rag doll. Another dude grabbed Derek and Troy by the backs of their jerseys and yanked them apart. Within minutes, the fight was over. Just like that, the football team and basketball team were on opposite sides of the cafeteria, breathing heavily and glaring at each other like they still wanted to throw hands, but they didn't. The lacrosse guys just stood there in the middle, like the neutral zone between two warring countries. And then, because high school is high school, someone started clapping, then another person, and another. And before long, the entire cafeteria was cheering and clapping for the lacrosse team like they were some kind of heroes. It was ridiculous, but at the same time, it was kind of amazing. I mean, when else do you see an entire cafeteria full of teenagers giving a standing ovation for a bunch of lacrosse players who just saved the day? The aftermath, though, that was a different story. The next day, the principal called a school-wide assembly to address the incident. I'm sure they were planning to dish out serious punishments, but instead they gave us this long, boring lecture about sportsmanship and how we should be working together as a school, not fighting against each other, blah blah blah. Half of us weren't even paying attention because we were too busy reliving the cafeteria brawl in our heads. Surprisingly, no one got expelled, but a few players from both teams got suspended for a week. And the lacrosse team, they got a bunch of extra credit from the teachers for their leadership and quick thinking. Like seriously? I mean, they did break up the fight, but it was still kind of weird seeing them get treated like school heroes. Now every time I go back to visit, someone inevitably brings it up. Hey, remember when the football and basketball teams almost killed each other and the lacrosse team had to save the day? It's become one of those legendary high school stories that just gets crazier every time it's told. But yeah, that day, that's one I'll never forget. Story number 3. High school was a strange time, but nothing compares to what happened during our school's annual Teachers' Day event. The day started off like any other Teachers' Day, a bit of a celebration, some students goofing off more than usual, and the teachers pretending they were okay with us skipping real work. It was basically a day where the whole school let loose, and most of us just enjoyed the chaos. But this particular Teachers' Day, let's just say it's infamous for what went down, and I'll never forget it. The event was in full swing when we heard shouting from outside. At first, it didn't seem like anything major, just some students messing around near the gates. But then the shouting got louder, angrier. Soon, the entire student body was craning their necks, looking out of the windows to see what was happening. What we saw was a full-on brawl between two groups of students just outside the school grounds. It wasn't your typical school fight either. This was bad. Fists flying, kids getting thrown into fences, backpacks being used as weapons. The teachers noticed the commotion and started running toward the gates, trying to break it up. Our school had a security guard, but he was an older guy who never seemed like he was up for stopping a brawl like this. Still, he was the first one out there, blowing his whistle, trying to push the crowd back. But things were getting out of hand fast, and that's when Mr. R, one of our history teachers, ran out to try and help. Now, Mr. R was the type of teacher who genuinely cared about his students. He was one of those teachers who actually knew what was going on in our lives and always tried to keep things calm. So seeing him rush into the middle of this chaos wasn't all that surprising. But what happened next? Well, that was something no one could have predicted. Mr. R managed to push through the crowd, getting between the two fighting groups, trying to calm them down. But the fight wasn't stopping. I could see the panic on his face as he realized things were spiraling out of control. That's when, in a moment of desperation, he made a decision that would change everything. He turned to the school's security guard and grabbed his gun. At first, I thought he was just going to wave it around, fire a warning shot or something to get everyone to back off. But Mr. R wasn't exactly trained for this kind of thing. And in the heat of the moment, as he fumbled with the gun, his finger slipped on the trigger. The shot rang out, louder than anything I've ever heard in my life. Time seemed to freeze. For a split second, no one moved. No one even breathed. We all just stared in shock as the sound echoed off the school walls. And then came the scream. I'll never forget that scream. One of the students had been hit. It wasn't a fatal shot, not yet, but you could see the blood pouring from his leg where the bullet had grazed him. He dropped to the ground, clutching his thigh, while everyone around him started panicking. Some kids ran, others froze in place, unsure of what to do. The teachers, who had been watching from the sidelines, now rushed forward, some screaming for help, others trying to take control of the situation. But Mr. R, he just stood there, staring at the gun in his hand like he couldn't believe what had just happened. I don't think any of us could. The next few minutes were a blur. The school's administration was on the scene almost immediately, pulling Mr. R away, trying to get the injured student to the nurse's office while someone called 911. The cops showed up not long after, and suddenly our calm little teacher's day turned into a crime scene. Yellow tape went up, and we were all herded inside, told to stay put while they sorted everything out. I remember sitting in the classroom with my friends, all of us in stunned silence, whispering to each other about what had just happened. We kept glancing out the window, watching as paramedics arrived, as Mr. R was put into a squad car, as the injured student was wheeled out on a stretcher. The whole school was in shock. The kid who got shot, he survived, thank God, but he ended up dropping out of school not long after. Some said he transferred. Others whispered that his parents pulled him out because they were planning to sue the school. I never saw him again after that day. As for Mr. R, he was arrested on the spot. It was all over the news. Local teacher involved in school shooting incident. The media didn't care that it was an accident. They just ate it up, twisting the story into something far worse than it actually was. I heard later that Mr. R was sentenced to some jail time for negligence, but I don't know what happened to him after that. His career was over, that much was certain. The school, of course, tried to cover it all up as much as they could. They downplayed the incident, called it a tragic accident, and tried to move on. But no one in our town could forget what happened that day. For months, every conversation was about the shooting, the fight, Mr. R. The teachers were different after that, stricter, more nervous, like they were all walking on eggshells, afraid something else might happen. Even years later, when we'd all graduated and moved on, the memory of that day still lingered. It's one of those stories you tell people when they ask about high school, one of those moments where you realize just how quickly everything can change. One second, it's just a normal day, and the next, someone's life is hanging in the balance because of one wrong move. I guess that's the thing about high school. You never know what's going to happen, and sometimes, the wildest stories aren't the ones you expect to tell. Story number 4. There are some things from high school you just don't forget. For me, it wasn't a prank or a party. It was a rumor that spiraled so far out of control that it became something straight out of a nightmare. I still don't know how much of it was true, but the way it spread across the school, it felt like one of those urban legends that's too crazy to be made up. It was about a guy named Sam. Now, Sam was this quiet, awkward guy. He wasn't part of any cliques or sports teams, didn't hang out with a big group of friends. Mostly, you'd see him walking the halls with his head down, keeping to himself. He was one of those kids who seemed to fade into the background, the kind of guy you'd forget was there unless someone pointed him out. But that all changed in the spring of our senior year, when the rumors started. At first, it was just whispers in the hallways, nothing out of the ordinary. High school is full of gossip, right? Someone always has a wild story or an exaggerated tale about what someone did at a party or who's secretly dating who. But this rumor, it was different. It wasn't about dating or partying. It was about Sam and, well, something that happened out by the school's ag farm. If you didn't go to a school with an agriculture program, the ag farm was this fenced-off area behind the main building where the FFA, Future Farmers of America, kids took care of animals, cows, pigs, sheep, that kind of thing. It was kind of isolated, tucked away at the far end of the property, and mostly the ag kids were the only ones who ever went there. One day, I was in gym class when I heard someone talking about the incident. A couple of guys were snickering and making these vague, gross jokes about Sam. I didn't think much of it at first. It's high school. People are always making fun of someone for something. But by lunchtime, the whole school was buzzing with the same story, and that's when I heard the full rumor. Apparently, Sam had been caught doing something unspeakable with one of the sheep in the ag farm. The rumor was that he'd been alone out there when it happened, and somehow, the sheep had clamped down so hard that he couldn't. Well, you get the idea. It was sick and bizarre, and honestly, no one really knew if it was true. But the rumor spread like wildfire, and by the end of the day, it was all anyone could talk about. It was the kind of story that took on a life of its own. People started adding their own details, making it more outlandish, more graphic. Some said the ag teacher had walked in on him. Others claimed the sheep had to be put down because of what happened. Kids were making crude jokes, drawing disgusting things on the bathroom walls. Sam couldn't walk through the halls without someone pointing and whispering behind his back. I don't think I'd ever seen anyone get isolated so fast. By the end of the week, Sam had stopped coming to school altogether. The rumor got so big that even the teachers caught wind of it, though none of them dared to bring it up directly. You could tell they were aware of what was going on, though. They had this uncomfortable, tight-lipped look every time they saw Sam, like they knew something horrible had happened, but didn't know how to address it. The weirdest part was that no one ever confirmed the story. No one had any real proof. It was just this whisper that had turned into a tidal wave of gossip, and whether or not it was true didn't seem to matter anymore. The damage was done. The weeks went by, and Sam didn't come back to school. Rumor had it that his family had moved out of town, that they couldn't handle the shame of it all. Some said his parents had sent him to a different school far away. Others claimed he'd been homeschooled after that, never to be seen again. The story just ended. No one knew what happened to him, and eventually, the rumor faded as new gossip took its place. But for that brief, intense period, it was all anyone could talk about. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. High school is brutal, but this was something else. It wasn't just bullying. It was like we'd all participated in some collective cruelty, feeding off this ridiculous rumor until it consumed someone's entire life. And the worst part? None of us ever questioned it. No one ever stopped to ask if it was true, if there was any proof, if maybe we'd all just let a stupid joke go too far. We just let it happen. I think about Sam sometimes, wonder where he is now, if he ever managed to move on from what happened. I wonder if he even knows that most of us eventually forgot about it, that we moved on with our lives, while he was left to pick up the pieces of a reputation that might have been destroyed over nothing. High school can be cruel like that. You get caught in the crossfire of one bad rumor, and it can take everything from you, your friends, your confidence, your future. I don't know if Sam's story was true or not, but I do know that we never gave him the benefit of the doubt, and that's something I'll never forget. Story number 1. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a weekend out in the woods to get away from everything. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. It was me, my buddy Josh, and our friend Sarah. We'd packed up everything, tents, food, fishing gear, you name it, and headed out to this spot deep in the national forest that Josh had been to once before. According to him, it was secluded, beautiful, and perfect for camping. We reached the site just before sunset, the golden light filtering through the trees as we set up camp next to a small creek. It was one of those perfect picture book moments. The air was crisp, the smell of pine was everywhere, and the only sounds were the rushing water and the occasional chirp of birds. No cell service, no noise, just the three of us and nature. I couldn't have asked for anything better. The first night went exactly as planned. We built a fire, roasted some marshmallows, and sat around telling stories. Eventually, we crawled into our tents, the sound of the creek lulling us to sleep. Everything felt calm, peaceful, just like I'd imagined. It was the next day when things started to feel off. We decided to go for a hike that morning, following a trail that wound deeper into the woods. It wasn't an official trail, just something Josh had come across the last time he was out here, but it was easy enough to follow. The trees got denser, and the light that had been so warm and welcoming the day before now seemed dimmer. The further we went, the quieter everything got. The birds stopped chirping, the breeze died down, and there was this stillness in the air that didn't sit right with me. We must have been hiking for about an hour when we stumbled upon this old, run-down cabin. It wasn't marked on any maps, and there were no signs anyone had been there in years. The roof was partially collapsed, the windows shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Sarah, being the curious one, immediately wanted to go check it out. I hesitated, that weird feeling in my gut starting to tighten. Josh was all for it though, so I followed them reluctantly. As we got closer, I noticed something strange. The cabin looked abandoned, sure, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading up to the door. Big ones, like someone had been there recently. I pointed them out to Josh and Sarah, but they brushed it off. Probably just some hikers, they said. But that feeling in my gut, it was getting worse. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The place smelled like mold and rot, but what struck me was how out of place it felt. There were empty food cans in the corner, some old blankets piled up like a makeshift bed, and scattered cigarette butts on the floor. Someone had been here, and recently. Okay, we've seen it. Let's go, I said, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. But just as we turned to leave, I heard it. A twig snapping. Not outside, inside. Did you guys hear that? I whispered, my heart starting to pound. Josh and Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, but then it happened again. This time, the sound was louder, closer. Someone was in the cabin with us. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. We need to go, now. Josh was still looking around, trying to figure out what was going on, but that's when we all heard it. A low, raspy voice coming from the shadows, somewhere in the back of the cabin. Where do you think you're going? I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. We bolted out of the cabin, sprinting down the trail as fast as we could, the sound of footsteps behind us growing louder. Whoever was in that cabin wasn't just some random hiker. They were chasing us, and they were fast. We ran for what felt like miles, not stopping until we were completely out of breath and our legs felt like jelly. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone charging after us, but eventually, the footsteps faded, and the forest was silent again. We didn't stop until we made it back to our campsite, where we collapsed by the fire, gasping for air. What the hell was that? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone in those woods, and whoever, or whatever, was in that cabin had no intention of letting us leave without a scare. That night, none of us slept. Every rustle of the wind, every crack of a branch, made my heart race. We packed up first thing in the morning, abandoning the rest of our weekend plans and heading back to civilization. On the drive home, we barely spoke. It wasn't until we reached the highway that I finally allowed myself to relax. But even then, that feeling in my gut lingered. Something had been watching us out there, something dangerous. I don't know who or what was living in that cabin, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. Sometimes you've just got to trust your gut, because it might be the only thing standing between you and something you can't explain. Story number 2. There's something about late night drives that's supposed to be peaceful, right? You roll down the windows, put on some music, and enjoy the quiet roads with no one around to bother you. Well, not this night. This night became the single most terrifying moment of my life, and I'll never forget the gut feeling that saved me. I had just finished visiting my cousin in the next town over, a small, sleepy place that didn't see much excitement. It was late, probably around 11:30 p.m., and I had about a 45-minute drive ahead of me to get back home. No big deal. I'd driven that stretch of road 100 times. It was a straight shot, mostly highway, surrounded by nothing but fields and trees. I remember feeling relaxed at first, the hum of the engine mixing with the sound of the night. The road was empty, not a single car in sight. The moon was full, lighting up the landscape enough that I didn't even need my high beams. I was halfway home when I noticed headlights behind me, just a single pair in the distance. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but after a few minutes, the car sped up and got closer. Much closer. The car pulled up right behind me, practically tailgating. I glanced in my rearview mirror, trying to get a look at the driver, but the headlights were so bright that I could barely see anything. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed glued to my bumper, and this sinking feeling started creeping up inside me. I tried to tell myself it was just some jerk in a hurry, someone who'd eventually pass me and go on their way. But they didn't. Instead, the car swerved into the other lane and sped up, pulling alongside me for a few seconds. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I glanced over, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see anything, just the silhouette of the car. Then, as quickly as they'd pulled up beside me, they fell back behind me again. That's when I knew something was wrong. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an impatient driver. Whoever was behind the wheel was toying with me, and I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with no one around to help. I tried speeding up, hoping I could outrun them, but they matched my speed. Every time I accelerated, they did too. Every time I slowed down, they did the same. It was like they were trying to box me in, control the pace of the drive. Panic started bubbling up in my chest as I realized I had no idea what they wanted, but it wasn't good. That's when the gut feeling hit me. I had to do something, and I had to do it fast. There was an exit coming up, a small, unmarked dirt road that led off into the woods. I knew it didn't go anywhere useful, just to some old backcountry trails. But at that moment, it was my only option. I turned my blinker on, hoping they'd think I was about to pull off. As I approached the exit, I jerked the steering wheel at the last second, swerving onto the road without signaling. The tires screeched as I sped down the dirt path, the car bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. For a split second, I thought I'd lost them. The road was narrow and rough, and I didn't see their headlights behind me. But that relief didn't last long. In my rearview mirror, I saw the glow of their headlights again. They'd followed me. I floored it, my car fishtailing on the dirt, but I couldn't shake them. The road was too rough, and I wasn't going fast enough to lose them. Then, up ahead, I spotted something. The entrance to an old service road that ran parallel to the highway. It was hidden by overgrown trees and bushes, and it was barely wide enough for a car. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and veered off the dirt road, praying they wouldn't see me. I killed my lights and parked behind some bushes, my heart pounding in my ears as I sat there in the darkness, holding my breath. For a moment, nothing happened, and then I saw their headlights pass by, speeding down the road where I'd been just moments before. They hadn't seen me. I waited until their lights disappeared completely before letting out the breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. I stayed hidden there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. I kept expecting them to circle back, to find me sitting there in the dark, but they didn't. Eventually, I got up the courage to start the car again and slowly made my way back to the highway, taking the long way home just to be safe. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted, but the feeling that they had something sinister in mind stuck with me for a long time. It wasn't until later that I heard about a string of attacks on drivers in that area. People being followed, run off the road, and robbed or worse. The police never caught the people responsible, but the description of the car matched the one that had been chasing me that night. If I hadn't trusted my gut and swerved off the road when I did, I don't know what would have happened. But I'll tell you one thing. Now every time I drive that stretch of highway, I make sure I'm not alone, and I keep my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, because you never know when someone might be watching, waiting for the right moment. Story number 3. You never really expect things to go wrong at a place like a family reunion. I mean, it's supposed to be one of the safest settings, right? Everyone's just hanging out, grilling burgers, and talking about the old days. But that day, I'll never forget the way the air shifted, the way my gut twisted before everything went to hell. It was the middle of summer, one of those perfect afternoons where the sky is blue and the sun is blazing. We were at this big county park by a lake, maybe 30 or so of us. Cousins, aunts, uncles, you name it. We had rented out this picnic shelter, one of those open-air buildings with a roof and picnic tables inside, perfect for family get-togethers. There were kids tossing a football, adults setting up grills, and a few of us just lounging around, soaking up the sun. After a while, someone noticed the sky getting darker. Not like sunset dark, but that deep, menacing kind of dark you see when a storm is coming. No one was too worried, though. Summer storms are a dime a dozen around here. It had rained for a bit, cool everything off, and then the sun would come back out. We started packing up the food and moving the coolers inside the shelter, ready to wait out the rain. But something felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but as we were bringing everything in, I got this feeling. It wasn't like the usual, oh, here comes the rain vibe. No, this was something deeper. A gnawing sense of dread started bubbling up in my chest, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was like the air had changed, heavier, thicker. I stood there for a second, staring out across the lake, trying to figure out what was bothering me. And then I saw it. A funnel cloud, way off in the distance, swirling lazily above the treetops. Now, I've lived through storms, plenty of them. Tornado warnings? Sure, I've seen a few. But this time, something clicked inside me. It wasn't just the sight of that funnel cloud. It was the way the wind shifted, the way the sky seemed to close in on us. That gut feeling was screaming at me, louder than anything I'd ever felt before. We need to leave, now. I turned to my wife, who was chatting with my sister, and grabbed her arm. Get our daughter, get in the car. She looked at me like I was crazy, but one glance at my face must have convinced her something was seriously wrong. My brother-in-law saw the panic in my eyes too. What's going on, man? He asked, his voice tense. Tornado, I said, my voice shaky. We need to leave, now. I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned and saw that distant funnel cloud. He didn't say a word, just started shouting for everyone to pack up and get in their cars. But it was too late for packing. The wind picked up out of nowhere, gusting so hard that one of the picnic tables inside the shelter started to move. It was like nature had flipped a switch from calm to chaos in a heartbeat. People started rushing, grabbing their kids, yelling for everyone to get to safety. I sprinted to the car with my wife and daughter, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the wind. As soon as we got inside, I turned the key, but I didn't even have to put the car in gear before the tornado siren started wailing. The sound was so loud, it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. My wife and daughter were both crying, and all I could think about was getting us the hell out of there. Through the windshield, I could see the funnel cloud getting closer, picking up speed. I slammed the car into reverse and backed out of the parking lot, glancing at the picnic shelter one last time. Some of my relatives were still running for their cars, and part of me wanted to scream at them to move faster, but my instincts were telling me to keep going. We peeled out of the lot and onto the road, the tornado siren still blaring in the background. It wasn't until we were about a mile away, safe in the shelter of a gas station, that I realized just how lucky we were. The storm hit hard, harder than anyone expected. By the time we made it to safety, the sky had turned a sickening shade of green, and the wind was ripping through the trees like they were made of paper. We waited out the storm, huddled together in the gas station's back room, with a few other people who had fled the park. The tornado passed us by, but when we got word about what had happened back at the reunion site, my heart sank. The picnic shelter we'd rented? Gone. Just a slab of concrete left, with debris scattered everywhere. The tornado had hit it dead on, leaving nothing behind. Cars were flipped, trees uprooted, and the place looked like a war zone. If we'd stayed even a few minutes longer, we would have been trapped there. No one would have survived. I'll never forget the feeling in my gut that day, the way it told me to run before my brain could process what was happening. That instinct saved my life, my wife's life, and my daughter's. The rest of the family got out in time, thank God, but none of us ever look at storms the same way again. Sometimes the scariest moments in life are the ones where you don't have time to think, just time to act. And if you're lucky, you'll listen to that voice inside you before it's too late. Story number 4. You never think a quick stop at the store could turn into one of the scariest moments of your life, but that's exactly what happened to me. It started as a normal Friday afternoon, and I was out running errands, picking up a few things before heading home for the weekend. My last stop was at this small convenience store a couple miles from my house. I just needed to grab some milk and snacks, nothing out of the ordinary. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of cars, and inside it was quiet too. The cashier gave me a nod when I walked in, and I nodded back. No big deal. I grabbed a basket and started walking through the aisles, taking my time. But then, halfway through, I noticed a guy walk in. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up even though it was warm out, and something about him immediately felt off. He didn't head for the shelves or grab a basket. Instead, he walked right past me toward the back of the store, not looking at anything, just pacing around. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. It's not like people can't wander around a store, right? Maybe he was waiting for someone, but something about the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around, made me feel uneasy. I kept shopping, trying to ignore him, but as I walked to the front of the store with my basket, I noticed he wasn't pacing anymore. He was just standing near the back, watching. The second I saw his hand disappear under his hoodie, something in me screamed, "Leave, now." I didn't stop to think. I didn't even go to the cashier. I just turned and walked straight out of the store, my basket still in hand. My heart was pounding, and I was trying not to look like I was running, but but everything inside me was screaming to get out of there. As soon as I reached my car, I tossed the basket on the ground, fumbled with my keys, and jumped inside. I barely had the door shut when I saw the guy come out of the store. But now, he wasn't just some random guy. He had a gun. He was holding it low, hidden under his hoodie, but it was unmistakable. I ducked down in my seat, watching as he looked around the parking lot, scanning for something, someone. My car was parked near the back, and I guess he didn't notice me, because after a few seconds, he turned and walked back into the store. My hands were shaking as I started the car, adrenaline flooding my body. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I drive away? What if he saw me leaving? My heart was racing, but that gut feeling, the one that had told me to leave, was still there, telling me I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. I backed out of the parking lot as slowly as I could, trying not to draw attention. As I pulled onto the road, I saw a car pulling in, completely unaware of what they were walking into. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them to turn around, but there was nothing I could do. I drove down the street, my hands still shaking, and pulled over a few blocks away to call the police. I told them everything about the guy, the gun, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. They said they'd send someone out right away, but by the time they got there, it was too late. I heard about it on the news later that night. The guy had robbed the store at gunpoint, holding up the cashier and the two customers who walked in after me. One of the customers, a woman in her 20s, had tried to run, and he shot her. She survived, thank God, but she was in critical condition. The guy got away with a few $100s, but the damage he left behind? That was worth so much more. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being one of those people. If I hadn't listened to that gut feeling, if I'd stayed in the store just a few minutes longer, I would have been there when it all went down. I could have been the one on the ground, begging for my life, or worse. It's a strange thing, feeling grateful and guilty all at once. Grateful that I got out, that I wasn't hurt. Guilty that I didn't do more, didn't warn anyone, didn't call the police sooner. But that gut feeling, it saved my life. I've learned to trust it ever since. It's not something you can explain, but when it hits, you've got to listen. I still drive by that store sometimes, though I haven't gone inside since. Every time I pass it, I think about how different things could have been, how close I came to being caught in something terrible. And I remind myself that sometimes, that gut instinct is the only warning you get before everything changes in the blink of an eye.